Our website is designed to streamline.
Listen to part of a lecture in a meteorology class.
Okay, this may sound like an odd way to open a meteorology class, but for a moment, let's consider why civilizations like the Roman Empire rise and fall. The obvious answer would be things like invasions or revolutions, but we've suspected for a while now that climate may have played a role. But it's been difficult to find evidence. Recently, though, a team of researchers in Switzerland realized that the evidence might already be available, although it was being used for another purpose. The researchers made use of tree ring samples that came from the remains of ancient trees, and what's called archaeological wood from ancient structures. Anyway, tree rings are the circular patterns in wood formed by seasonal growth, and in the samples they had that went back centuries, they found some compelling connections between climate variability and historical events in Europe. The samples were originally used by archaeologists to date ancient buildings, furniture, and other artifacts. The important thing is that these rings are precipitation sensitive. That is, their width is affected by the amount of moisture, for example, from rainfall the trees had access to in a given year. A good year meant more growth and a wider ring, while a narrow ring might imply a moisture deficit. So, by analyzing the tree ring data, the researchers were able to determine they could get a much clearer picture of weather patterns throughout the centuries than we've ever had before. So, how do we know this analysis is trustworthy? Well, the researchers also analyzed modern tree rings and compared them to actual precipitation measurements, the kind of measurements we don't have for ancient and medieval times. And in the period from 1901 to 1980, the results of their analysis match well with recorded values. They also looked at historical records, written sources from the medieval period, and what they found is that 88 eyewitness accounts confirm nearly all of the climate extremes that appear in their data for that time. And looking at the findings, basically what we see is that the climate changes revealed by these tree rings correlate in some interesting ways with the stability of European societies. I'll give you a few examples. One of the biggest findings was that a period of exceptional climate variability, so cold and rainy one year, really hot the next, that kind of thing, matched up with an event called the migration period that occurred from about 200 to 500 CE. The migration period was a time of mass migration in Europe and includes, you guessed it, the fall of the Roman Empire. The people in this period faced some of the most severe challenges in European history, socially, economically, and politically, and it's possible that the extreme climate conditions we see in the data contributed to this crisis. And if this seems to be a misreading of the data, or perhaps just a coincidence, well, let's consider the opposite condition. Consistent wet and warm temperatures tend to mark periods when society was stable. Sustained population growth in the European countryside throughout ancient and medieval times, for example. And the disruptions to these periods of stability stand out. Periods like the Little Ice Age, which began in the late 1500s. Here, the data show a drastic temperature drop, and this, of course, had real consequences for societies. We can see some of these consequences in the tree ring data we have before we even analyze it. What I mean is that the availability of wood samples gives us additional information. We can tell how many trees were harvested and how this number varied over time. When civilization was growing, thriving, think the peak of the Roman Empire, a lot of trees were cut down to support construction. But during times like the migration period, societies were unstable. There was less construction, and tree harvests decreased noticeably. So the number of samples available to study as well as the climatic conditions the trees grew in, tells us a lot about the development of civilization. Remember, though, the climate data is just one of many variables. As the researchers themselves acknowledge, historians shouldn't draw any bold new conclusions because, of course, even if these new ideas are correct, that doesn't disprove traditional views about what causes a society to grow or decline. I would like to see more studies like this, though. Remember, though, the climate data is just one of many variables. As the researchers themselves acknowledge, historians shouldn't draw any bold new conclusions